The satellite feed flickered once, then went dark. In the operations center buried 3 stories beneath Bagram Airfield, 12 screens went black simultaneously. Major Garrett Voss stared at the dead monitors, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. The last image burned into his retinas. An A-10 Thunderbolt II pulling vertical through a canyon so narrow its wingtips nearly kissed stone, missile contrails spiraling behind it like the fingers of death reaching upward. Then nothing. Just static and the soft hum of cooling fans. Someone in the back row whispered a prayer. Voss set down his cup carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever remained of hope in that room. The aircraft's transponder had stopped transmitting 4 minutes ago. Radio silence for 3. Standard procedure said to wait 15 minutes before declaring an aircraft missing. Everyone in that room knew 15 minutes was a formality, a kindness extended to the living before they had to confront the mathematics of loss. The pilot's call sign was Ember. Voss had questioned the choice when he first read her file 8 months prior. Call signs were supposed to be ironic, brutal, earned through some humiliating incident or personality flaw that your squadron would never let you forget. But Ember had arrived at the 74th Fighter Squadron with that name already attached, transferred from a unit no one wanted to discuss. Her personnel jacket was oddly thin for someone with 217 combat hours. Commendations, yes, but the spaces where explanations should have been were redacted, black bars across digital pages like missing teeth in a skull's grin. She was quiet during briefings, surgical in her flight planning, and completely unremarkable in every social setting. The younger pilots called her ghost behind her back, not because she was elusive, but because she seemed to haunt the ready room rather than inhabit it. Now her aircraft was gone. $400 million of American engineering turned to vapor somewhere over the Hindu Kush. Voss pulled up the mission profile on his tablet. Close air support for a reconnaissance element trapped on a ridgeline, surrounded by insurgent forces that had seemingly materialized from the mountain itself. Ember had been 30 kilometers away, returning from a different sector with minimal fuel and a malfunctioning hydraulic system. She had volunteered anyway. Voss had approved it because they had no other assets in range and because men were dying. Simple math. He told himself that then. He would tell himself that for years afterward. The silence in the operations center stretched like wire pulled too tight, waiting for something to snap. Outside, the Afghan sun hammered down on flight line concrete, and somewhere in those ancient mountains, the question hung unanswered in smoke and silence. The reconnaissance team heard it first. Sergeant Marcus Hallbrook was pressing gauze against a hole in his teammate's shoulder when the sound rolled down the valley like distant thunder, impossibly low and sustained. He looked up from the blood on his hands, searching the sky through the haze of gun smoke that hung over their position like a shroud. The insurgents had pulled back 20 minutes ago, retreating to positions higher up the ridge where they could rain fire down at leisure. Hallbrook's team was pinned against a cliff face with 3 casualties, no air support, and maybe 40 minutes of ammunition remaining. He had already composed the letter he would never get to write to his daughter. The sound grew louder, not the whistle scream of a fighter jet but something rougher, industrial, a flying chainsaw grinding through heaven itself. Hallbrook recognized it before he saw it. A-10 Warthog, close air support pilot's aircraft, built around a gun so large the plane was essentially a flying weapons platform with some engines and wings attached as an afterthought. He grabbed his radio. "All stations, this is Kodiak 13. I have air contact bearing 270, but we were told no birds available. Can anyone confirm?" Static answered him. Then a voice, female, calm as Sunday morning. "Kodiak 13, Ember 21. I'm approximately 90 seconds from your position. Pop smoke." Hallbrook fumbled for a smoke grenade, yanked the pin, and tossed it into the clearing. Purple smoke billowed up, a violet prayer against brown earth and gray sky. The A-10 appeared like something conjured from American mythology, screaming down the valley at an altitude that made Hallbrook's stomach clench. It was low enough that he could see battle damage. Holes punched through the vertical stabilizers, a section of the left wing trailing what looked like ribbons of torn metal, and dark fluid streaming from somewhere beneath the fuselage. The aircraft rolled inverted and pulled through. The GAU-8 Avenger opened up with a sound that defied description, 7 barrels rotating at maximum rate of fire, each 1-second burst releasing over 60 rounds of 30-depleted uranium death. The mountain ridge above them erupted in fire and shattered stone. The insurgent position simply ceased to exist, transformed from threat to memory in the space of 4 heartbeats. They pulled up vertical, rolled level, and came around for another pass. Ember 2-1, Kodiak 1-3, Holbrook transmitted, watching the damaged aircraft line up again. You're trailing fluid and your left wing looks like Swiss cheese. What's your status? Brief pause, then, still flying. 2 words delivered with the emotional inflection of someone reading a grocery list. She made 3 more passes, each one surgical, economical, devastating. The insurgent force that had seemed inexhaustible 15 minutes ago scattered like leaves before a storm. When the last guns fell silent on the ridge, Ember pulled up and away, heading northwest toward Bagram. Holbrook watched her go, trailing that dark fluid like blood across the sky. His radio operator, a kid from Nevada named Torres, sat with his mouth open. "That pilot just saved our lives with a plane that should be falling apart," Torres said. Holbrook nodded, watching the A-10 disappear into the distance, a dying bird refusing gravity and logic and every reasonable expectation. "Get their call sign and bird number. I want to know who that was." In the operations center, Major Voss watched his screens come back to life. The satellite feed resolved, showing an A-10 limping northwest, losing altitude gradually but maintaining controlled flight. His hand moved to the radio controls. "Ember 2-1 Bagram actual, say status." The response came through with background noise that suggested multiple system failures, warning buzzers, hydraulic squeals, the groan of overstressed metal. "Bagram actual, Ember 2-1. Airframe damaged, hydraulic system Alpha is dead, Beta is dying. I'm flying on cables and prayer. Request priority landing, straighten approach." Voss was already signaling. Across the flight line, fire trucks began rolling toward the runway. Ambulances followed. The tower cleared all other traffic, and suddenly every eye at Bagram Airfield was turned toward the northwest sky, waiting. The A-10 appeared as a dark speck against the mountains, growing larger but not faster. It was descending, but the descent looked controlled, deliberate. Voss could see the damage now through the tower cameras. The shredded wing, the punctured stabilizers, the trail of hydraulic fluid creating a mist behind the aircraft. "She's not going to make it," someone said behind him. "She already should be dead," Voss replied. "Whatever happens now is borrowed time." The A-10 lined up on final approach, gear coming down in a series of mechanical shutters visible even from the ground. The landing was a masterclass in controlled catastrophe. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the runway with all the grace of a wounded eagle. It rolled for 3,000 feet before stopping, sitting crooked on the concrete, streaming fluids from multiple wounds. Emergency crews swarmed it immediately. The canopy opened, and Voss got his first good look at the pilot as she climbed down. She was smaller than he expected, moving with the careful precision of someone checking for injuries they haven't noticed yet through the adrenaline. Her flight suit was dark with sweat. She pulled off her helmet, and Voss saw a face he recognized from briefings. Angular features, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. "Lieutenant Colonel Dana Kovich, call sign Ember." She spoke briefly with the fire chief, declined the offered medical evaluation with a shake of her head, and began walking toward the operations center. Voss met her at the door. Up close, she looked tired in a way that went deeper than one mission, one day. "That was unauthorized," he said, "because someone had to say it. You were ordered to return to base. You had mechanical issues and minimal fuel. Kovich looked at him with those two focused eyes. Yes, sir. You could have died. Your aircraft is barely recognizable as an A-10 anymore. The damage assessment team is going to have nightmares writing that report. Yes, sir. Voss studied her, trying to find something beneath the professional mask. Why did you turn around? For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not much, just a flicker like light catching on deep water. Because no one else was coming, sir, and those men didn't deserve to die on that ridge. She walked past him into the operations center, leaving Voss standing in the doorway, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with the quiet, unremarkable pilot he thought he knew. Behind him, maintenance crews were already surrounding the damaged A-10, measuring, photographing, shaking their heads in professional disbelief. The aircraft should not have made it back. Physics and engineering said it was impossible. But there it sat on the flight line, bleeding fluids onto concrete, evidence that sometimes impossible just means not yet accomplished. The debriefing lasted 4 hours. Kovich sat at a conference table surrounded by officers whose combined rank could have run a small war, and recounted every decision, every maneuver, every system failure with the precision of someone who had lived through something once and was now forced to dissect its corpse. The reconnaissance team had been 30 seconds from being overrun when she arrived. 30 seconds. The margin between life and death measured not in miles or minutes, but in heartbeats and the time it takes to pull a trigger. She had expended 90% of her ammunition in those first 2 passes, knowing that if she missed, she would not get another chance. The insurgents had been dug into positions carved from the mountain itself, invisible from above except in the moment of muzzle flash. Major Voss asked most of the questions. He was good at his job, thorough without being cruel, pushing for details without forcing her to justify decisions made when death was measured in fractions of seconds. But there were other officers present, staff types who fought wars from air-conditioned offices, and they asked different questions. Questions about fuel consumption rates and unauthorized tactical decisions, and what precisely she had been thinking when she turned around against direct orders. Kovich answered each one with the same flat affect, emotion sanded away until only fact remained. But Voss noticed something. Her left hand, resting on the table, would occasionally make a small fist, then relax. A tell, barely visible, suggesting that beneath the professional calm was someone working very hard to maintain it. Your after-action report mentions pulling 7.2 GS in that canyon, a colonel from Wing Operations said, reviewing his tablet. The A-10 is rated to 7.3. You cut it close. Yes, sir. The missile had already committed. I needed to force it to overshoot, which meant out-turning it at the last possible moment. 7.2 was the number that worked. And if it had been 7.4, then we wouldn't be having this conversation, sir. The room went quiet. Someone coughed. Voss intervened before the wing operations colonel could respond. Walk us through the hydraulic failure. When did you first notice the problem? Kovich's eyes shifted to him, and he saw gratitude there, small and quickly hidden. She described the failure in technical detail. The warning lights, the increasing stiffness in the flight controls, the moment she realized she was essentially flying a brick with wings and attitude. By the time she had finished the 3rd gun run, she had been controlling the aircraft through manual reversion mode, using cables and mechanical linkages that were never meant to be the primary flight control system. How did you land it? This from a lieutenant colonel who actually flew A-10s and understood exactly how insane that landing had been. Very carefully, sir. A flicker of something that might have been humor. I kept speed high on final, used rudder to align, and prayed the gear would hold. Everything past that point was momentum and hope. The questions continued, picking apart her mission like investigators examining a crash site. But slowly, the tenor changed. The staff officers began to understand what the pilots already knew. They were not interviewing someone who had made a series of lucky guesses. They were talking to someone who had performed a miracle while their aircraft fell apart around them, and who discussed it with the emotional investment of someone describing a grocery store trip. When they finally released her, the sun had set and the base had settled into its nocturnal rhythm. Voss caught her outside the operations center. Colonel Kovich. She turned, waiting. That call sign, Ember, I've been meaning to ask where it came from. For a long moment he thought she would not answer. Then she looked past him, toward the flight line where her damaged A-10 sat illuminated by work lights, maintenance crews crawling over it like ants over carrion. From a wildfire, she said quietly. 6 years ago, California. Different squadron, different war. We were doing air support for firefighters and I stayed too long, got caught in a backdraft. Lost an engine and most of my hydraulics then too. Made it back flying on fumes and stubbornness. She paused. One of the firefighters we pulled out said I looked like an ember floating down from the sky when I came through that smoke wall. Name stuck. Voss nodded slowly. You have a habit of flying broken aircraft through impossible situations. No, sir, she met his eyes. I have a habit of finishing the mission. She walked away then, leaving Voss standing in the darkness. Realizing that her personnel files redactions probably contained stories that would explain everything, and nothing about the woman who flew aircraft that should have killed her and somehow always made it home. The reconnaissance team arrived at Bagram 2 days later, flown in by helicopter from their forward operating base. Sergeant Holbrook found Kovich in the ready room, reviewing flight plans for the next day's missions. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from focused concentration to polite curiosity. He carried something wrapped in stained cloth, and his hands were careful with it, reverent almost. Colonel Kovich, I'm Marcus Holbrook, Kodiak 13. You saved my team on that ridge. She stood and Holbrook realized she was shorter than he expected. Somehow, in his memory, she had been larger, mythic. But the woman in front of him was compact, efficient, carrying herself with the precise economy of movement that experienced pilots developed. Sergeant, how's your wounded? All 3 will make full recovery, thanks to you. He set the wrapped object on the table between them. We wanted to give you something. It's not much, but it seemed right. Kovich unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of metal roughly triangular about the size of her palm. It had been cleaned and polished, and someone had etched words into it. Ridge Line Angel, Kodiak 13. She stared at it, something unreadable crossing her face. We pulled it off your A-10, Holbrook explained. One of the maintenance guys said you wouldn't miss it. Piece of the wing section that got shot to hell. Figured if that metal could carry you through what it did, maybe you'd want it as a reminder. Kovich picked up the piece, turning it in the light. A bullet hole went through one edge and the metal was scored and burnt. Evidence of violence transformed into something else through context and intent. Thank you, Sergeant. You didn't have to do this. Yes, ma'am, we did. Holbrook's voice was firm. Every one of my team would be dead if you hadn't turned around. We were out of options and out of time. Then you came through that valley like the hand of God himself, flying a plane that looked like it had been through a shredder. Tors, my radio operator, he's been telling everyone who will listen. You're a legend now, whether you want to be or not. She looked uncomfortable with that. I was just doing my job. No, ma'am. Your job was to return to base like you were ordered. You chose to come back for us anyway. That's not job, that's character. He straightened to attention. We won't forget it, and neither will anyone else who hears the story. After he left, Kovich sat alone in the ready room, holding the piece of metal. The afternoon light slanted through windows, and dust motes floated in the beams like suspended moments. She thought about choices and consequences, about the narrow spaces between what orders say and what conscience demands. The metal was warm in her hand, heated by the sun and by something else, something that felt like responsibility wearing a new face. On the wall, a map of Afghanistan showed their area of operations. Red pins marked conflict zones, blue pins marked friendly positions, And somewhere in that cartographic representation of war was a ridge where 12 men had lived because she made a decision that defied logic and orders in equal measure. She wondered if they understood that she had been terrified, that every second of that gun run had been fighting against the voice in her head that screamed about fuel states and mechanical failures and the mathematics of survival. But she had made the turn anyway, because somewhere in her training, in the accumulation of hours and missions and near misses, she had learned that some things were worth the risk, some lives were worth the defiance. Some moments demanded you set aside the careful calculations and trust something deeper, something that had no name but felt like duty worn smooth by repetition until it became identity. Major Voss found her there an hour later. "We need to talk about your next assignment." She looked up. "Sir, Wing Command wants to put you in for a medal, Distinguished Flying Cross at minimum, possibly more depending on how the recommendation reads." He sat across from her. "It means interviews, publicity, the kind of attention that makes quiet pilots into public figures." Kovich's face closed off slightly. "I'd prefer to just get back to flying, sir." "I know, but sometimes we don't get to choose our own stories. Sometimes other people choose them for us, and we either accept the narrative or spend our energy fighting it." He gestured to the metal piece on the table. "What's that?" "A reminder." She didn't elaborate, and Voss didn't push. They sat in companionable silence, two professionals who understood that some things were better left unspoken, held close like talismans against the chaos that surrounded them. Word spread through military networks the way it always does. Stories passed from pilot to pilot, unit to unit, each retelling adding layers of legend while trying to maintain the core of truth. The damaged became a pilgrimage site on the flight line. Off-duty personnel would walk past it, taking photos, marveling at the holes punched through critical structures, the shredded wing that somehow maintained enough lift to keep flying. Maintenance crews worked overtime to repair it, but even they admitted it would never be the same. Some damage goes too deep to ever fully heal. Kovich tried to maintain normalcy, but normalcy was a creature that fled in the face of attention. Pilots who had previously ignored her now sought her out, asking questions about technique and decision-making. The younger officers looked at her differently, with a mix of respect and curiosity that made her uncomfortable. She had spent years cultivating invisibility, becoming a competent but unremarkable presence in ready rooms and briefings. Now she was visible, studied, mythologized, and she hated every moment of it. Captain James Reed, one of the squadron's more boisterous pilots, cornered her in the mess hall. "You know they're calling it the Ember Run now, right? That canyon pass you made. The video from your aircraft camera is being used in training scenarios. They're studying it like it's the Sistine Chapel of close air support." Kovich focused on her food. "It was a gun run, Reed. Standard procedure adapted for terrain constraints." "Standard procedure," Reed laughed. "Colonel, you pulled vertical in a canyon that's barely wider than your wingspan, with a missile on your tail and half your hydraulics dead. There's nothing standard about that. You rewrote the book on what's possible in an A-10. "The book," Kovich said quietly, "was written by pilots who did things just as difficult under worse conditions. I'm not special. I just got lucky." "Lucky?" Reed shook his head. "Holbrook and his team don't think it was luck. Neither do the intelligence analysts who reviewed the mission footage. You made 17 major decisions in 4 minutes and every single one was correct. That's not luck. That's mastery." Kovich stood, her food half-eaten. "It was survival, Reed. When your options are fly or die, you fly. That's all it was." She left before he could respond, but she could feel his eyes on her back, feel the weight of attention that she could not escape no matter how fast she walked. Major Voss watched these interactions from a distance, understanding something that perhaps Kovich did not yet see. The story was no longer about one pilot making one decision. It had become something larger, a symbol of competence and courage that the entire base needed in a war that offered few clean victories. People needed heroes, especially in places where heroism was measured in saved lives rather than captured territory. Kovich had become that symbol whether she wanted the role or not. He called her to his office 3 days after the incident. The medal recommendation has been approved at division level. They want you in Kabul next week for a ceremony. Kovich's expression could have been carved from stone. I'd rather not, sir. I know, but this isn't about what you want anymore. The command needs good news stories, visible reminders that what we're doing here matters. You're that reminder. I'm a pilot, sir, not a symbol. Voss leaned back in his chair. You're both now. And here's what I've learned in 22 years of service. You can resent the attention or you can use it. Make it mean something. Use the platform to talk about what matters. Because if you don't control your own narrative, someone else will, and you might not like the story they tell. Kovich was quiet for a long moment. What would you have me say, sir? The truth, that you were scared and did it anyway. That the aircraft was dying and you flew it home. That some missions matter more than orders, and that sometimes the hardest choice is the obvious one. He paused. That women can fly combat aircraft as well as any man, and that competence has no gender. She met his eyes then, and he saw understanding dawn. This was not just about her. It was about every female pilot who had fought for the right to sit in that cockpit, who had faced doubt and discrimination, and been forced to prove themselves over and over in ways their male counterparts never had to consider. When do I leave for Kabul? She asked. The ceremony was everything Kovich dreaded. Cameras, reporters, a general who read from prepared remarks about valor and exceptional performance. She stood at attention in dress uniform, feeling like an imposter, while someone pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on her chest. The medal felt heavy, weighted with expectations and narrative. When the general asked if she would like to say a few words, every instinct screamed to decline. But she thought about Voss's words, about controlling the narrative, and she stepped to the microphone. I don't think of myself as brave, she said, and her voice carried across the assembled crowd. Brave implies a choice made despite fear. I didn't feel like I had a choice that day. There were men dying on a ridge, and I had the training and aircraft to help them. The decision was simple, even if the execution was complicated. She paused, gathering thoughts she had not planned to speak aloud. I've been flying combat aircraft for 14 years. In that time, I've been questioned, doubted, and underestimated more times than I can count. Not because of my performance, but because of assumptions about what someone who looks like me can or cannot do. This medal doesn't change those assumptions, but maybe it starts a conversation. Maybe it makes one young pilot somewhere realize that the sky doesn't care about your gender. Physics doesn't give easier tests to men. The aircraft responds to competence, to training, to split-second decisions made under pressure. That's all that matters up there. The crowd was silent, attention focused in a way that felt different from the usual military ceremony. She continued. Every pilot makes a choice every time they strap into an aircraft, to fly well, to complete the mission, to bring themselves and their bird home safely. That day on the ridge, I made the same choice thousands of pilots make every day. I was just fortunate enough to have people notice. But the real story isn't me. It's every pilot who faces impossible situations and finds a way through them. It's the maintainers who keep these aircraft flying despite damage that should be fatal. It's the ground forces who trust us to show up when everything else has failed. She looked at the piece of metal in her pocket, the fragment her team had given her. We're all just pieces of something larger, and sometimes those pieces hold together through circumstances that should tear them apart. That's not exceptional. That's the baseline. That's what service means. When she stepped away from the microphone, the applause was genuine, and she felt something shift. Not acceptance exactly, but perhaps understanding. She had not asked for this platform, but now that she had it, she could at least ensure the message was true. After the ceremony, a young female captain approached her. Fresh face, eager eyes, the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been ground down by reality. Colonel Kovic, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been in the pipeline for combat aircraft, and I've been told more times than I can count that I should consider transport instead. That close air support is too demanding, too dangerous. But watching you, reading about that mission, it makes me think I can do this. Kovic looked at this younger version of herself. This pilot who still believed the system would be fair if she just performed well enough. Part of her wanted to warn this captain about the reality, about the constant need to prove yourself, about how excellence would be treated as the exception rather than the rule. But another part, the part that had pulled vertical through an impossible canyon, knew that warnings could become self-fulfilling prophecies. You can do this, Kovic said simply, but understand that you'll have to do it better than good enough. You'll have to be undeniable, not because that's fair, but because that's the reality. So train harder, study more, and never give anyone a reason to doubt your competence. Become so good that the only conversation possible is about your performance, not your gender. The captain nodded, and Kovic saw determination harden in those young eyes. Good. Determination was a better foundation than optimism. Optimism could be crushed by reality, but determination bent and adapted and found new paths forward. Major Voss found her later as she was preparing to return to Bagram. That was a good speech, honest, uncomfortable in the right ways. Did it matter, Kovic asked, or did I just feed the narrative machine? Both, Voss replied. But you fed it with truth, and that's worth something. The story is going to be told regardless. You made sure your version is part of it. They walked across the tarmac together, toward the helicopter that would return her to her unit. The Afghan sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of copper and shadow. Somewhere out there, operations continued, pilots flew missions, and the machinery of war ground forward regardless of ceremonies or speeches. Do you think it changes anything? Kovic asked. One speech, one medal, one story about a female pilot who had a good day. Voss considered this. Probably not immediately. Change is geological in the military, measured in decades rather than moments, but it adds to the weight of evidence. It makes it slightly harder for the next person to say women can't fly combat. It provides ammunition for the next captain who has to fight for her place in the cockpit. He smiled slightly. Revolutionary acts usually feel mundane to the people performing them. You just flew your mission. But other people will see it as something larger, and maybe that's okay. Kovic returned to Bagram expecting to resume normal operations, but normal had been redefined in her absence. The squadron treated her differently now, not with mockery or skepticism, but with a respect that felt both earned and burdensome. The younger pilots asked her technical questions, seeking wisdom from someone who had proven their competence in the most visceral way possible. The older pilots, veterans of decades of service, included her in conversations that had previously been closed to outsiders. She had been initiated into a club she never knew she was outside of, and the membership felt strange. Her repaired was returned to service, bearing scars that maintenance could not fully erase. The bullet holes had been patched, the hydraulic systems replaced, the wing structure reinforced. But you could still see the marks if you looked closely, ghost injuries written in slightly mismatched paint and replacement panels. The crew chief, a master sergeant named Williams who had been working on A-10 since before Kovic learned to drive, walked her through the repairs. She'll never be quite the same, Williams said, patting the fuselage with the affection people reserved for old friends and faithful dogs. But she'll fly. These birds are tough, built to take damage and keep fighting, kind of like their pilots, I guess. Kovic ran her hand along the repaired wing, feeling the seams where new metal met old. Think she's still airworthy? Airworthy? Williams laughed. Colonel, this bird flew home with half her guts hanging out and you at the controls. Airworthy is the least of what she is. She's proven, battle-tested. There's not another A-10 on this base with a combat record like hers now. She's just metal and wiring, Kovic said, but without conviction. Nah, Williams shook his head. She's more than that now. She's a survivor just like you." The next mission came 2 days later. Standard combat air patrol, nothing special. But when Kovich climbed into the cockpit of her repaired aircraft, she felt something different. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. She and this machine had been through something together, had faced destruction and refused it, and that shared experience created a bond that transcended mechanics and engineering. The flight was unremarkable. 3 hours of patrol, no contact, no drama. But when she landed and climbed down from the cockpit, she realized she had been holding tension she did not know existed. The fear that the repairs would not hold, that the aircraft would betray her at a critical moment, that the trauma sustained in that canyon had broken something essential that could not be fixed. But the A-10 had flown perfectly. Responsive, stable, reliable, proving that healing was possible even after catastrophic damage, that broken things could be made whole enough to function even if they carried scars. Captain Reed caught her on the flight line. "How'd she handle?" "Like herself," Kovich replied. "Different maybe, but still herself." Reed nodded understanding. "Good, because the squadron needs you both, and I'm not just talking about combat effectiveness." He paused, choosing words carefully. "The younger pilots look at you differently now. They see someone who walked the walk, who proved that competence matters more than demographics. That's important, more important than you probably realize." Kovich wanted to reject the responsibility implied in his words, to insist she was just a pilot doing a job. But she was learning that perception created its own reality, that whether she wanted it or not, she had become an example. The question was not whether she would be an example, but what kind of example she would be. That night in the privacy of her quarters, she took out the piece of metal Hallbrook's team had given her. The bullet hole caught lamplight, and she wondered about the physics of that moment, the trajectory of the round, the angle of impact, the fraction of an inch that separated a hole in metal from a hole in flesh. War was full of such moments, infinitesimal decisions and random chances that determined who lived and who became memory. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the fights to get into flight school, the evaluations where she had to be twice as good to be considered adequate, the call sign earned in fire and smoke, marking her as someone who had survived what should have killed her, the slowly accumulating weight of proof, mission after mission, demonstrating competence until even skeptics had to acknowledge her capability. And she thought about the captain she had met in Kabul, the young pilot with optimistic eyes who still believed merit would be enough. Kovich knew better. Merit was necessary but not sufficient. You also needed visibility, opportunity, and the willingness to push through doors that others insisted should remain closed. The ceremony, the medal, the attention she hated, these were tools that could open doors for others. Refusing them out of discomfort was a luxury she could no longer afford. She placed the metal fragment on her desk, a reminder of fragility and resilience intertwined. Tomorrow she would fly again, and the day after, and the day after that, building a record that could not be dismissed, creating a foundation that others could build upon. Not because she wanted to be a symbol, but because someone had to go first, and she had been handed the role through circumstances and choices and a canyon that had almost been her grave. 3 weeks after the Ridge incident, intelligence reported increased insurgent activity in the same sector. Major Voss called an emergency briefing, and Kovich found herself in a room full of pilots reviewing tactical maps and threat assessments. The insurgents had fortified new positions, learned from their previous defeat, and were massing forces for an offensive against coalition positions. Command wanted air superiority established before ground operations commenced. "This is going to be contested airspace," Voss said, highlighting areas on the map. "They've moved in anti-aircraft systems, including shoulder-fired missiles and possibly something heavier. We're looking at concentrated fire from elevated positions with excellent sight lines. It's a shooting gallery, and we're the targets." The room absorbed this information with professional calm, but Kovich could read the tension in her fellow pilots. Contested airspace meant risk, meant the possibility of aircraft falling from the sky in flames, meant that someone might not come home. These were realities they all accepted when they signed up, but acceptance did not eliminate fear. It just made fear something you learned to function through. Colonel Kovich, Voss said, and every eye turned toward her. You know this terrain better than anyone now. What's your assessment? She stood, moving to the map. Her finger traced the valley where she had made her gun runs, then moved to the new threat positions. They're smart. These positions are mutually supporting with overlapping fields of fire. If we come in low for gun runs, we're exposed from multiple angles. If we stay high, we sacrifice accuracy and effectiveness. The terrain channels us into predictable flight paths, which is exactly what they want. Recommendations? Voss asked. Kovich studied the map, her mind running through scenarios and possibilities. We need to hit multiple positions simultaneously, deny them the ability to concentrate fire on single aircraft. Coordinated strikes from different vectors, fast and aggressive. Make them choose which threats to engage, then punish their choices. Captain Reed spoke up. That requires more aircraft than we have immediately available, unless we're pulling birds from other sectors. Which creates vulnerabilities elsewhere, another pilot added. The room fell silent, the tactical problem hanging over them like a physical weight. Then Lieutenant Morrison, one of the newer pilots, spoke hesitantly. What if we use deception, create false targets, draw their fire, then come in from unexpected vectors while they're engaged? Voss looked interested. Elaborate. Morrison moved to the map, gaining confidence as she spoke. We send in drones first, low and loud, mimicking attack profiles. They'll light them up, revealing their positions and wasting ammunition. Then the actual strike package comes in from different angles, hitting them while they're exposed and potentially out of position. It was a good idea, creative and tactically sound, but Kovich saw the flaw immediately. The drones won't draw fire if they look like drones. They need to be mistaken for actual threats, which means flying them in patterns that make them look like manned aircraft making attack runs. Can we program that level of sophistication? Reed asked. Maybe, Morrison said, but it would take time to work out the flight profiles, and we'd need someone who understands both drone capabilities and actual attack patterns well enough to make the deception convincing. Voss looked at Kovich. You flew those attack patterns 3 weeks ago. Could you translate them into drone programming? The room's attention focused on her again, but this time it felt different. Not like being examined or judged, but like being consulted. She had earned a voice at this table through actions rather than rank, and now they wanted to hear what that voice said. I could try, Kovich replied, but I'd need technical support from drone operations and real-time intelligence on their response patterns. This only works if we can adapt on the fly. You'd be coordinating from here, Voss said, not flying. Kovich felt something clench in her chest. The idea of being grounded while her squadron flew into danger felt wrong on a fundamental level, but she forced herself to consider the tactical picture objectively. If I'm flying, I'm one asset among many. If I'm coordinating, I can potentially multiply the effectiveness of every aircraft we commit. It's the right call, even if I don't like it. Voss nodded, respect evident in his expression. Let's work up the plan. Morrison, you're with Kovich on drone coordination. Reed, start briefing the strike package. We execute in 72 hours. The room dissolved into focused activity, but Kovich remained at the map, staring at the terrain that had almost killed her, that had marked her aircraft with scars that would never fully fade. She was being asked to send other pilots into that same danger, to coordinate their movements like chess pieces while sitting safe in an operations center. The role felt like betrayal, even though she knew it was necessary. Reed found her there 15 minutes later. You okay, Colonel? I should be flying, she said quietly. No, Reed replied. You should be doing what you're best suited for in this situation. And right now, that's making sure the rest of us don't die. Your ego can take the hit." She looked at him sharply, but saw no mockery in his face. Just honest assessment from someone who had flown enough missions to understand the difference between glory and effectiveness. "This is harder than flying," she admitted. "I know," Reed said, "but that's why Voss chose you. Because you're capable of hard things and because you'll do what's necessary even when it costs you personally. That's leadership, Colonel. Welcome to it." The next 72 hours blurred into a continuous cycle of planning, simulation, and adjustment. Kovich worked with drone operators who spoke a language of algorithms and flight parameters, translating her visceral understanding of attack profiles into mathematical models that could be programmed into unmanned aircraft. It was frustrating work, trying to capture the intuitive decisions of combat flying in code and variables. How did you quantify the moment when you committed to a gun run? What algorithm determined when to break off an attack because the threat assessment had shifted? Lieutenant Morrison proved invaluable, bridging the gap between Kovich's tactical experience and the technical requirements of drone operations. She had a gift for understanding what Kovich was trying to explain even when the words were inadequate, translating intent into actionable programming. Together, they built flight profiles that mimicked real attack runs while staying within the drone's capabilities. "It's not perfect," Morrison said, reviewing their work on the third night. "The drones don't have the same performance envelope as an A-10. They're lighter, more maneuverable in some ways, but they lack the sustained power and weapons load. If the insurgents are paying close attention, they might spot the difference." Kovich studied the simulation runs they had executed. They don't need to be perfect. They just need to be convincing for 30 seconds, long enough to draw fire and reveal positions. After that, it doesn't matter if the insurgents realize they've been deceived because the real strike package will already be inbound. And if they don't take the bait, then we adapt. That's why I'll be coordinating in real time. We'll have multiple contingencies, different approaches based on their response. Flexibility is our advantage. Major Voss appeared in the doorway, looking tired but focused. "How's the plan coming?" "As good as it's going to get," Kovich replied. "We've built 3 different approach scenarios, each with variations based on threat response. The drone operators know their profiles, the strike package is briefed, and we have redundant communication systems in case primary nets go down." "And you're comfortable coordinating this from the operations center?" Kovich hesitated, then nodded. "Comfortable is the wrong word, sir, but I'm capable, and I understand that this is where I'm most valuable for this specific mission." Voss studied her, and Kovich had the sense of being evaluated again, but differently than before. Command is aware of this operation. They're interested in the outcome, both tactically and as a case study in coordinated strike doctrine. Success here could influence how we approach similar situations across the theater. The implication was clear. This was not just another mission. It was an experiment, a test case, and Kovich was the primary architect. Success would validate her approach and potentially save lives in future operations. Failure would be highly visible and potentially career-ending. The pressure was enormous, but she had learned to function under pressure. It was perhaps the one constant in her career. "We'll make it work, sir," she said with more confidence than she felt. The night before the operation, Kovich walked out to the flight line. Her A-10 sat in its revetment, maintenance crews performing final checks for the next day's missions. She stood in the shadows, watching them work with the quiet efficiency of professionals who knew that other people's lives depended on their competence. One of the crew chiefs noticed her and waved. She waved back, a small gesture of solidarity between people who understood the stakes. She thought about the pilots who would fly tomorrow, who would trust her coordination, who would put their lives in the hands of the plan she had helped create. The responsibility felt crushing, heavier than any G-forces she had experienced in flight. But she also felt something else, determination. These were her people, her squadron, and she would do everything in her power to bring them home safely. Captain Reed found her there, couldn't sleep either. Too much running through my head, Kovich admitted. Second-guessing decisions, wargaming scenarios. That's good, Reed said. Means you're taking it seriously. The pilots who scare me are the ones who are too confident, who think they've planned for everything. You know there are variables you can't account for, which means you'll adapt when things go sideways. And if I adapt wrong? Reed was quiet for a moment. Then people might die, but people might die anyway, and at least with you coordinating, they've got someone who understands the stakes and will fight like hell to minimize casualties. He paused. I'm flying lead tomorrow, and I'm glad you're in the operations center because I trust your judgment more than I trust any algorithm or predetermined strike package. The words settled over her like a weight and a gift simultaneously. Trust, the most valuable currency in military operations, earned slowly and lost instantly. Reed was offering his trust freely, and she knew she could not afford to waste it. Don't die tomorrow, she said quietly. Reed laughed. I'll do my best. You just make sure we're hitting the right targets at the right time, and I'll handle the actual flying part. They stood together in the darkness, two professionals on the eve of an operation that would test everything they had learned, and Kovich felt the strangest sense of peace. Not because she was confident in the plan's success, but because she was surrounded by people who understood the mission and were willing to risk everything to accomplish it. That was worth something, maybe everything. The operations center at 400 felt like a